Energy is inherently a part of everything we do in our lives, but one of the least understood things.
I can see a future where there is limitless and free energy. And that's a pretty beautiful world to live in.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Power to the People. John, I would love to continue with where we kind of left off on the last episode when we were talking a lot about all these different types of energy and how they're developed and the positives and negatives. And I remember we were kind of discussing, what's the next step to that? Because it's one thing to kind of understand the energy, but then how does it apply to kind of the bigger picture and how we see our day-to-day lives and how we interact with energy? So I think kind of diving a little bit deeper in this one will be a lot of fun. So where do you kind of want to pick up from where we were at?
Well, so last time we kind of assembled a little toolkit of energy resources, potential energy resources, kind of broke it down, chemical energy like fossil fuels or, like ammonia, green hydrogen, nuclear, and what I was calling process energy, which probably more commonly known as renewable energy, but some type of energy that taps into an ongoing natural process and so gets more efficiency that way. And I was thinking, well, how do we use this toolkit? We have all these pieces now, but we need to have a picture in mind, that we're working toward. And so I thought it would be useful to start off kind of setting a frame of reference for this conversation. Where are we coming from? Where do we want to go? What do we want to see when we get to the future, the new energy future? Because I think that when you are creating different trajectories, into the future, it's really crucial to be clear right up front about what you're trying to achieve, or like what your goals are, what your beliefs are, and, if you can see your own biases, kind of what those are as well. Because there's all kinds of different ways that we can prioritize various outcomes, like wealth creation, environmental impact, political power creation, population or demographic changes, whether, a particular policy or technology tends to cause peace and collaboration or conflict and isolationism, and so on. So my personal beliefs and biases, just so you know where I'm coming from, is that I see life in the universe as a pretty special thing, just kind of on a very large scale. Like, we're the only ones that we know about, here on this planet. And, so that makes it a fairly unique thing in terms of like the history of the universe, in reality. And so I think it's something worth protecting and nurturing, and all, any kind of different way that we can. Because I believe that that life in general should be given opportunities to thrive both now and in the future. And as kind of the dominant form of life on this planet, we as humans have kind of a unique ability to both understand and change the world, and the other life on it, whether we intend for those changes to actually happen or not, right? We can have all sorts of unintended consequences or intended consequences. But the important thing is that we can do that. We can affect that change. We can understand things. We can study them. We can make, evidence-based decisions along the way. And I believe that this gives us an opportunity, maybe even an obligation, to step outside of kind of the day-to-day survival-based living that most forms of life engage in on this planet, and do what we can to be good stewards for each other and the planet, all the other life. So
I love the way you put that. Seriously. Like, because I wonder about just this impact that we do have. I mean, like, yes, as humanity, but also specific when it comes to energy. Energy, it is kind of a domino effect into so many different areas of every species' lives. And I think that part of that consideration is the speed at which and the magnitude of the impact that we have at this moment in our energy decisions. So I just love that you kind of put that into perspective of just like, this is a really cool opportunity, but also it's kind of a bigger one than we've had in the past, I think.
Yes, yeah, and the more knowledge and technology we've accumulated, the faster we can effectuate change, and on a larger and larger scale. And so that does, it does kind of put more pressure on us to like make sure that we're taking things in a direction that we want to go. So yeah, with that context in mind, I look at things, or I kind of developed a framing that works for me, and I'll share it. Maybe it'll work for you too. But basically, it's taking a bunch of different information, a bunch of different data on, impacts of a particular technology or policy on human society as a whole, as like a unit. Not breaking out little chunks and being like, okay, this is good for them, this is good for them, but like looking at us as a whole species. And the names that I've come up for these, I mean, again, like process energy, it's just kind of like, this is just kind of how I think about it. But I see it kind of broken into like a spectrum from pro-social to antisocial. And, I think people are kind of familiar with like somebody who has antisocial tendencies is someone who just like can't, really operate within the normal bounds of society and, can have a destructive effect. We don't really talk so much about the opposite, which is pro-social, which is like things or behaviors or whatever that that makes society work better for everybody. It's a rising tide that lifts all boats kind of deal. So this framing has the advantage of setting factors that result in humanity being able to thrive as kind of the guiding benchmark. So instead of like proxies for human well-being, like wealth creation or health outcomes, etc., those kind of capture a little narrow slice, but they don't get the full picture of like, hey, is this actually going to be good for us, like as human beings living on planet Earth right now? But it does come at a cost of like, it's a little more complicated to kind of take all these ideas and all of these facts and like fit them into, someplace on that spectrum between pro and antisocial. So I thought I would just give a little examples of like, what does it mean to be pro or antisocial? So it's kind of it's basically like a utilitarian outlook, like the, philosophy of utilitarianism that is like, what are the things that create the greatest good for the greatest number of people? And of course, there are some issues with that because you can, like have like sacrificial populations. So I think like for the pro or antisocial distinction, you have to put some important kind of caveats on that utilitarianism. One of the most important ones is that in my belief, I don't think this is pro-social at all. I think that there should not be any involuntary sacrifices needed to maintain the status quo of things. So like slavery, very, very antisocial. Yes, it can create more wealth for the people that are the slave owners, but it severely limits the opportunities and the the possible happiness and freedoms of the people that are being enslaved, obviously. Or kind of more slightly more abstract things like environmental sacrifice zones, like Cancer Alley in the southern U.S. or mining communities in the Congo. Those kind of things are, in my belief, very antisocial as well. But on the other end of the spectrum, things like a well-functioning democracy, equal rights for all people, all of those things I believe to be pro-social in that they maximize freedom and opportunity for everyone. So
I think that's a pretty good way to define it. Because also I was just thinking through a lot of that framework of how energy fits into a lot of those topics. Even as you were going through it. And it was like a lot of those are, equal access to energy, for example. It's not just phones and computers. It's internet, it's lighting, it's energy for food, for water, for kind of the baseline infrastructure that we use day to day. And so I think when you look at it through that framework of the pro-social, antisocial, it kind of works from energy because it really does touch all those. And even just as you were going through those, like, yeah, a lot of that actually kind of makes sense. If we give people access to energy, a lot of these things become a little bit more equalized across the board.
Yeah. And, energy is so foundational. I think we started off last time talking about like, energy being the stuff that makes things happen. Mm-hmm. And, so anytime we want something to happen, we want to affect some type of change in the world, you basically need energy, So mm-hmm. Yeah, it is all of these things are very like tied together, because so much of, especially current human civilization is built on like large scale production and use of energy. So yeah, anyway, now that we kind of have that, we figured out kind of generally what the picture on the front of the jigsaw puzzle box looks like. Now we can start to put the pieces together and try to match that. So I'll start with just basically like kind of doing a little bit more assembling of our toolkit, because last time we went through the different types of energy, and kind of got into some of the specific technologies, but basically one of the outcomes of that discussion, I suppose, was that we talked about how different energy sources produce different outcomes. I mean, that's a very simple way to put it, but it's important to keep in mind not all energy technologies are created equal, and so some have. I mean, they all have pros and cons. And you have to be careful about how you weigh those and implement them. So energy sources that are reliant on limited resources, or that cause intergenerational burdens, or that disrupt the normal balance of natural cycles like the carbon cycle, must necessarily be limited in how much and where they are used. And that's just that's the big, I'm not talking about any one specific type of, energy technology right now, but just kind of generally, like, those are things that you would need to limit their use.
Because it's also just finite. Even when you mention finite demand or finite supply, you have supply and demand curve that says like there's only a limited amount that you would want to be able to use given a finite amount.
Yeah. Those three examples, the limited resources, intergenerational burdens, and disrupting the normal balance of natural cycles, like those are all things that cause negative feedback loops. That is, feedback loops that kind of constrict the conditions that allowed for whatever, it to happen in the first place. So So like with the limited resources, eventually we'll run out, and then that just kind of takes care of itself. The intergenerational burdens, eventually, like, they'll become so burdensome to future generations that they can't continue on with the original activity anymore, so on and so forth. So that immediately kind of puts uses for things like fossil fuels and nuclear on a more kind of restricted case-by-case basis. Obviously, that's not what we're seeing today, but that's why we're having this conversation. So that leaves renewables, or process energy, and non-fossil chemical fuels. So like things that we can produce without mining out that ancient carbon from deep underground. It leaves those to form basically the backbone of our new energy future, whatever that looks like. Along with energy storage technologies like batteries, flywheels, pumped hydro storage, et cetera, to mediate the push and pull of demand and supply. So
how would you rate stored energy? Because I do wonder about that, because in one way, like, I would throw it in the renewable side in terms of how it manages energy and how it fits into the grid system. But at the same time, a lot of those battery techs do rely on something that would have a finite supply at the end of the day. So where would you put it on that? Because I'm always curious. It's always that push and pull.
Yes. Yeah. So I would consider like batteries in particular to essentially be kind of like a specialized form of chemical energy storage. I mean, because basically you put in energy, it gets stored in chemical bonds, and then you can pull it back out, which is, I mean, that's basically how fossil fuels formed. They're kind of like batteries for the earth. The sun came down, made all these chemical bonds, and they got trapped underground, and they've been in storage, and we've been pulling them out and breaking the bonds and releasing the energy. So I think that for batteries, like the idea is sound, and it certainly can be done renewably, or at least in a sustainable way. Um, I think some of the newer battery chemistries are, they're starting to move away from like more kind of like rare or expensive or hard to mine metals towards like more common things like um, the LFP, the lithium iron phosphate. Like all of those things are pretty abundant
Widely
in the Earth's
available.
crust.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so part of it is like the resources that go into creating the battery, and then part of it is what do we do with those resources once they're in the battery. So especially after the battery has run its useful course of life, do we put it in a lower demand application where like the degradation isn't going to be as important, or do we try to crack it open and recycle those materials? So
That's actually a really good point, by the way. The fact of like the longevity of batteries. And I know not to completely take a detour on what we were talking about, but I just find this interesting because a lot of people assume whether it be battery in car or battery in a lot of things that like once it has the life, that's it. Like there's not maybe a second life that thing can have under not as much power demand or the recyclability of the products that are inside of it. I think there's that whole other side of battery that weirdly people haven't been talking about quite as much is like the second life.
Secondary market for batteries. It's we haven't really gotten there yet because like all the EV batteries that are in cars nowadays on the road, those have a good 10-20 years to keep rolling around on the roads before they get to the point where the degradation might cut off like a third of the mileage or something like that. But that's still a huge amount of battery capacity left over. So yeah, there can be battery backup systems that pull batteries from EVs and put them into like a stationary installation or whatever. But there's there's all kinds of ways to do it. And this is one of the things, actually, I'm glad we brought this up. This is one of the coolest things about all of this stuff is that really like we're kind of just limited by our imagination. And the progress of like technological evolution, because there's so many different ways to harness and store and use energy that once you start moving away from fossil fuels, it like this whole new world opens up of possibilities. Because fossil fuels, it's a very like you find it in the ground, you take it out of the ground, you process it, you ship it to where it's going to be used, and then you burn it. Like that's basically the end all be all
It is a singular
of fossil
event
fuels. Yeah. So, but with renewables, you get to kind of tap into different parts of that process. You can whatever. We'll get more into it, but yeah. So basically, that's our toolkit so far. But at least for like the physical technologies, there's also the technology of policies and regulations, which are very important and can be quite tedious because they have to be very well thought out. And it's kind of like the operating code for a state or for an entity, a political entity. So we need to consider like how those policies and regulations, or how different policies and regulations can help us effectively and efficiently deploy and use the physical technologies that we have put into our toolkit. So one of the big ones that has proven to be very effective and without as many of the drawbacks as some others are incentives. So basically carrots that you can be like, hey, I'm not gonna like hit you with a stick if you don't do it what I want you to do, but
this is a really good idea.
Yeah. It's like, can I sweeten the deal, a little? So that would be something like the federal investment tax credit, the ITC, which has been, obviously it's mostly going away in the next couple of years, but it's been really, successful so far. California and other states, some other states have, like a suite of ongoing grants and rebate programs and, all kinds of stuff. And then even things like, like regulatory constructs like net energy metering, or it's not quite the same, but renewable portfolio standards, that's more of a stick. But it can also be like an incentive for people to be like, hey, we know that our government is like heading this way because they've set these renewable portfolio standards for clean energy, and so we have the comfort and the stability of like knowing this is going to keep going this trajectory longer term. So
and also that sets the expectation, or at least the understanding, that this also happens across all different industries. Like, it's not just energy. It's like the government's or our government's ability to offer incentives for innovation in a lot of different areas. That's how a lot of the times we progress, whether it be across technology or healthcare or energy or whatever it may be. Generally, those programs are in place. I just want to set the stage that it's not just because energy and this is the one thing that you can take advantage of.
Thank you for bringing that up, because these are like incentives and penalties. Those are like two of the most powerful tools in a government's toolkit. And regardless of what kind of outcome or industry or sector that is being considered, you can incentivize people to do what you want, or you can punish them if they don't. Like, it's basically, those are your two options. So in short, basically we want to use use policies and regulations to create systems, structures that make it easier for people to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing. But with, another important caveat, like, we don't want to dip into oppression or authoritarianism. So that means using a lot more carrots than sticks. So you want to use as many carrots as you can and as few sticks as you can to get to the desired outcome. So we've got the physical technologies, we've got the policies and regulations. So once we start to use those in a intelligent way, hopefully in a wise way too, energy prices will drop, reliability and resiliency will grow, and both of those things will make it easier and cheaper to do basically anything that requires energy, which is most things. So you can do things like prioritizing local and distributed energy resources over distant and centralized ones, which increases your efficiency. If you have energy that's produced right where it's used, then you have very essentially no losses in that process, as opposed to long distance transmission lines. It also, that process of moving away from centralization to distributed also reduces the motivation for resource-based conflicts, which is kind of a big deal. And really it encourages more participation in the market, in the industry, by both businesses and individuals. That creates healthy competition that drives innovation. So, it's distributed energy is kind of like anti-monopoly. It just kind of inherently, because it's distributed. It's harder for a single entity or a small handful of entities to own all of the the solar panels in the country or whatever. Whereas it's actually fairly straightforward for a handful of companies to own the oil wells in the country or the refineries. Because that's a very centralized, kind of deal.
Well, and it also goes back to the conversation I was having with Derek and Rob about just the idea that these EVs that are all driving around, these are literal mobile power stations. And if we were playing out this role of, if you started to have bidirectional energy where, you can freely share your energy and receive income for it, or, receive energy from somebody else that you paid for, you could theoretically go to the grocery store and your groceries were at a discount because you got paid to charge back the grid while you were grocery shopping anyway. And it was just this idea that it really is democratizing not only the physical entity of it, but also ideologically, it just is a complete shift for the brain to be able to think, hey, I have a mobile power station that I can use accordingly and manage, and it's an asset that I can actually use. Whereas like usually cars are mostly depreciating assets in a way.
Yeah. It's just they're kind of just money pits that move you around. Yeah. Whereas like with EVs, they're, it's like you said, it's another possible resource. It's another, way to create opportunities, for yourself or for others through grid stability, et cetera. But that is touching on one of the most important things, I think, about all of, this new energy future stuff is like, there are things that you can do with this technology that you cannot do with past technologies. And so the EVs are one part of that, but if you kind of extrapolate that to the whole system of like, seeing things as resources instead of just, costs, and looking at, how do people really use energy? How do we want to use energy? A big one, a big cool thing about all this is that we have the opportunity to create these basically a totally new paradigm for how energy is produced and distributed throughout our society. So basically the foundational unit would be like a neighborhood, or like a business district, or maybe even a single building that is on a microgrid that can disconnect from the larger grid with solar, or probably solar could be geothermal, but also like a battery to shape that load. So starting with that basic little cell, if it can produce 90% of its own power, then you only need a tiny little bit from elsewhere. And so you put that grid next to another one and another one and another one and another one, and have them all be able to share power, with each one being mostly self-contained. Maybe, certain times of the year, or, maybe certain times of day, there's more production in one cell than the other. You just import, export. And it, becomes a very simple like interface between the two grids. Each one is kind of its own little isolated cell of complexity, like figuring out, where power is going to go, where it's coming from. But then talking cell to cell, it's just like, how much power do you need? Oh, I don't need any. Do you need any? Yeah, I'll take some, So you take that and you extrapolate it across a city or a state or even a country, and then suddenly you've got something that is so much more resilient, so much more efficient, and it just creates like a lot of different opportunities and incentives, for businesses to like participate in their cell, to not just be a drag on it. It's kind of like everyone's involved in this, rather than like some few big companies that are like sitting, and there's a few people at the heads of these companies that are making decisions about that affect all of our lives and how we use electricity and what the price is going to be, and yada yada. So if we have the tools,
like an earlier conversation we had, though, was also just that concept that when you do have that interplay between the grid, you're also wasting less energy. Like that concept where we were talking about how, like, was it 40% just wasted every day because it's like, well, we generated too much, we can't store it. You also, in that bidirectional future where all these microgrids are talking to each other, I would imagine you have way less of a waste of captured energy too, which at the end of the day is just a win for everybody. It's like any waste is generally bad, whether it be a business or as a person, as a animal in the woods. Any type of waste is not ideal. And so for us to optimize that, I think it gives us such a huge advantage. So it's like, why not pursue that?
Right. Yeah. And so that the rejected energy versus the service or energy services, that graph that we were going through, most of the rejected energy, if you recall, came from essentially combusting fossil fuels. Like that was where most of the waste came from. And so this electrified cell system relies much more on electricity as kind of the foundational unit, rather than like fossil fuels, natural gas, or coal or oil. And so it just inherently reduces that inefficiency. It reduces that energy loss just by virtue of having electric, or like solar panels directly convert sunlight into electricity that gets, stored in a battery, and then that gets put into your EV. And like that's a super efficient process, basically kind of the most efficient that we can do right now. So if we have the tools to do that, and we have the tools to make it so, like, say, a down power line in a forest 100 miles away doesn't knock out your power sitting, at home in like a city, doesn't that just seem like a better way to do it? Like, where's the downside? I mean, there are, it takes a lot to get there, but I think it ultimately, that's the way to go. Like, that's the future. To me, that's the new energy future, is this decentralized, electrified, innovative space that, really brings power to the people, and, creates this system that reduces conflicts, that reduces polarization, and that, unlocks all of these cool opportunities, like vehicle to grid charging, or, like whatever, discharging, I guess, but load shaping, essentially. So, or, you can power your home. Like my parents have, they have sleep apnea. They wear the CPAP machines, and there's been times when PG&E had to cut their power, and they ran their machines off of their plug-in hybrid.
Wow.
And yeah, so like that was like a medical kind of necessity situation where, they were able to like do things to maintain their health using their EV, and not even a full EV, just a plug-in hybrid. Or,
wow.
you got, one of those Ford Lightnings, and you work on a construction, thing that's like out somewhere away where, you're not tied to the grid. You can plug in all your tools to your truck and power it off of that. That's not something you could do with a traditional, pickup truck.
You generally would need to bring trailer a generator behind.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's probably an extra vehicle too. Unless, because if everybody's towing something, you got to tow now an extra thing just for power. But now you have all these little power stations.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the more you have, the more power you have available. Or as like free range grid storage devices. So like, California says, hey, we have everyone just turn on their air conditioners, and one of our natural gas power plants is down. Can everybody that own an EV plug in right now? And like that can like offset that peak demand, lower prices for everybody. There's like lots of benefits from that. And then
maybe that's what we're missing, is a branding issue. Instead of there's free range chickens, maybe we need free range energy. It's just like an understanding of, hey, this feels like a better thing.
Yeah, no cages for those cars. Or you can do stuff like remote off-grid fuel generation. Like you could do liquid fuels. You could do like hydrogen gas. So if you say you have like a research station or a construction site, or maybe you just live way out in the woods, and it's not feasible to like run power lines and or gasoline deliveries or whatever. You put up some solar panels, you put up a wind turbine, put up a battery, and then maybe an electrolyzer to create green hydrogen. Boom, you can power your trucks, you can power industrial equipment, like you can use it as a combustion source to heat your home, or for like high temperature industrial processes. Like that's pretty incredible. I mean, to me, that's basically like growing gasoline on your roof and like selling it from your driveway. Like that's that's a totally new paradigm from what we've been used to. And like somewhat related to that, I've seen there's been some pilot cases of green hydrogen powered boats that can generate their own hydrogen from seawater while they're sailing around. So like, can you imagine like sailing through an ocean of fuel, be basically unlimited? You got the sun above you, and you got the hydrogen source below you, and like you could potentially just keep going forever as long as you had all the right equipment on board to keep producing the hydrogen. But like that's
It's genius.
infinite power, basically, like as close as we're going to get. And I'm going to keep going a little bit more on this green hydrogen,
Yes,
even though
absolutely.
it's kind of something that like is not really on most people's radars yet, but it could be, and maybe it should be, because it's kind of like, if you have renewable energy sources, you have energy storage, green hydrogen is kind of like the third thing that ties that all together. That's like, here's a whole industry replacement. Here's a whole like economy like foundation. There's just so many ways to generate it, that, like using different energy sources. We've got kind of the standard electrolyzer, but we're also starting to figure out how to use like nanoparticles to increase the efficiency, because they're like basically all surface area, and that's that surface reaction that creates the hydrogen. There's hydrogen solar panels now, so like solar panels that directly take the sun, have a source of water, and pump out a green hydrogen. And even potentially, bioengineered bacteria, can produce hydrogen. So once you have this green hydrogen, then you can use it as a feedstock for like ammonia, alcohols, like non-fossil gasoline, or, like other fuels, even plastics, and like so many other stuff. Because it's so, like, you think about all those things, they're hydrocarbons. So we have carbon everywhere. If you can just take that and add some hydrogens to it in, the right places, then you can basically create anything that we can create using like petroleum products.
Wow.
So
That's incredible.
Yeah. And it's combustible. So, or you can run it through a fuel cell. So like either you can use it in a combustion engine. There are some issues with like just going, like 1-to-1 gasoline and hydrogen. Like they're
right.
Not totally compatible, but you can create a combustion engine that can burn hydrogen. And I mentioned earlier, it can also produce super high temperatures, which is something that renewables like weren't really good at doing before. So green hydrogen unlocks sustainable like steel processing, smelting, metal smelting, chemical synthesis, or like food processing. A lot of like industrial food processes, like they require high heats, like sterilization, pasteurization, et cetera.
Yep.
So yeah, those are all things that are basically possible right now, with the technology that we have right now, and like just more things are coming down the pipeline, every year. So yeah, so many different kind of possibilities. And
that's another one that I would argue is pro-social, because it's opening up all these possibilities and all these different ways that people can interact with energy. And it's also pushing innovation too. Like, it's not just the energy source that's feeding the already existing things. It's, you mentioned now, the ability to not have to ever refuel a ship. Well, that's a pretty fantastic innovation that can actually be applied in a lot of different ways. And so when you start looking at the knock-on effects that this has, of these types of energy sources, you have massive innovation happening across all these different sectors, because you had a tipping point that allowed more creativity to be had across the board for people who are dreaming up new ideas of how we can do X, Y, and Z. So it creates so much more opportunity, so much more possibility, and which I think is really, for me, it's that is kind of one of the guiding lights, behind my, like how I see everything, like our responsibility as people, whatever, but it's to create more possibilities. So that's kind of another way to like look at it, like pro-social versus anti-social is like, does this create more opportunities, or does it limit them? And I don't just mean like in the short term, because you can have, something like, allowing society to create like a billionaire class, like that creates a huge amount of opportunity for like a small number of people, but at the cost of limiting everyone else's. And so you kind of have to like look a little bit bigger picture when you think about like that. But I think it's a pretty powerful lens to view the world. I had a friend tell me a few years ago that, when you're out in nature, 1 + 1 does not equal 2. In fact, many, many times it equals 3 or 4 or 5, because just two things come together and so many things are produced from that. And I think we're just taught whether it be the scientific method or otherwise, traditionally we have always been taught that 1 + 1 = 2, input plus this equals output, and there's no opportunity for more to be had. But I think this is also opening up the door for that. But as we're starting to, I know they say biomimicry a lot, but if we throw biomimicry into the conversation, in how we produce our products and how we're doing our energy sources, if we just look to how kind of nature is actually working, there's a lot more abundance that can be had from that, from necessarily the application that we've had of just, let's kind of muscle this one through and make it work. I feel like now we're starting to observe, take notes of how it's kind of working in nature, and then going, oh, how do we actually work a little bit more like that, and then create renewable resources? Because that's what nature does. It is renewable inherently. If you kind of let it do its thing, it kind of takes care of itself.
I mean, at least on any time scale that's relevant to us as humans, like, yeah. I mean, it's, eventually the sun will run out, but that won't, that's not really relevant to us. We'll have bigger fish to fry at that point, but it's so going back out to a little bit of that bigger picture, like if we took all these tools, the physical energy technologies and like, the regulations, the policies, if we took all of those and used them in a pro-social way, used it to create more opportunities for everybody to, lift all the ships, to reduce polarization, to increase collaboration, what do we get out of it? We get a higher standard of living, just kind of across the board. We get reduced costs of just about everything because energy is so foundational to setting prices for stuff. We get less pollution and chronic health issues. We get more stable societal structures. More people are empowered with, like a basic standard of living, a basic standard of wealth. Then there's less need for conflict. And, if we're also moving away from these like patchy distributed, like deposits of fossil fuels or, other, key resources to a more sustainable, renewable, distributed approach, then, that reduces the gap between the have and the have-nots, which is one of the things that has always driven conflict in human societies.
Always.
But I think the coolest thing that we get out of all of this is something that is kind of the gold standard for like survival and thriving of any type of life on this planet, which is the ability to intentionally balance the Earth's climate to maximize diversity opportunity. So if we can say like, hey, we can measure the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we can measure the greenhouse gas effect, and we have these policies, or we have these tools that we can use to either, increase it or decrease it. Right now, we really need to decrease it. Then we have the ability to basically like change the Earth's climate however we want, which is something that like no other species on Earth in our Earth's history has been able to do.
Could we have that power? That's the question. Yeah, the question is, should humanity have that power?
I think if we get there, the way to get there is, I think, through this like pro-social, wisdom-driven pathway, which hopefully, will result in a society that is more clued into like, hey, we need to like think long term. Like if we're thinking about like thriving as a species, like we need, we can't just like lose ourselves in these like petty short-term squabbles. And obviously that's pretty utopian attitude, but we can dream. But
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, because the alternate way to get to that point would be to have like an extreme dictatorship, like a planetary dictatorship, where you have like one person or like an oligarchy in charge who decide like, okay, we're going to cut carbon emissions by like taking away all of your cars and destroying the manufacturing capability or whatever. So, which again would really increase that gap between the have and the have-nots to the point where it would drive more conflict. So like, it's not just that Technology has to be useful and, whatever, but it also has to foster the conditions that allow us to keep using that technology. So that's why, things that cause climate change are like a negative feedback loop, like industrial processes, burning fossil fuels. Like that's a negative feedback loop, and that the more we change the climate, the more fossil fuels we burn, the more we change the climate, the harder it gets for us to keep extracting, refining, and burning fossil fuels on the same scale. So we can either let that process happen naturally, or we can speed it along by allowing more wealth concentration at the top, which has been a big driver of this whole process. Or we can take this third path, this middle path through, where we're actually trying to make the world a better place. This is something that I think like our generation and past, like we just had no conception of, but like, wouldn't it be great to think and maybe even know that things will be better for the next generation? we lost that, as a society, and, kind of as a world too, with climate change. It's like that optimism for the future. And I think that's something that is so crucial about, this whole new energy space and, these new technologies, is that I'm not a believer in like a technological fix for our problems. I think that like the fixes for our problems, like really they come from our hearts. But these technologies, they give us the opportunity to change the way in which we interact with each other. They give us this opportunity to create more pro-social structures, in our industry, in our economy, in our society, which, it's a big part of it. And I think just getting people excited about the future again is, that's huge.
I think you bring up such a good point, because I think when you're looking at the future, I think, and obviously we're of a different generation, but if you go 3 generations back, I think some of the things that they would do that was laying the foundation for the next generation, they wouldn't see the result. They had to make the best decision they could with their hearts and say, well, let's hope in 60 years it'll do that, but let's just keep laying the foundation. And while I believe that to still be true today, I think our feedback loop is so much shorter. We can actually see the result of our change in a lifetime. And I think that we're more thinking about that necessarily than farther down the road. But I think we need both. It's like this is about the longevity and laying the foundation for the next generation. Because what does the next 60, 70 years look like? I mean, I remember when my great-grandfather talked about the first cars. It was like, wow, that's incredible. And when you think 60 years down the road, what is our world going to look like? Well, we're making those decisions right now and laying the foundations for what will grow. Whether it will be exponentially different than what the previous generations had, who knows? Time will tell. But at the same time, it is happening faster, and we are part of that process. And so maybe another episode as we dive a little bit more to the ethics side of things, because I think a lot of this is how do we just like, how do we come to good decisions? I mean, you mentioned middle way, which is a bit of a Buddhist discussion, but like that idea of like, how do you navigate this world, what's a good for me, my community, the broader species? How do people navigate some of those decisions? I think is just as important as the decision itself of like what technology to go with.
Yeah. It all, it can all kind of funnel down to either like isolationism and individualism, like survival of the strongest, or altruism, which is truly like it's seeing yourself as being equal and reliant on others, and recognizing that you're all part of this unit. You're in it together. What you're trying to do is maximize the survival potential of that unit, not just you yourself. Like that is so much more powerful, so much more possibility can happen that way. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny when, I think we're so much more of a community driven species than I think we realize right now at the moment. that yeah, we've always thrived in community. And if you look at generally the pockets of the planet where people live the longest too, a lot of a major component of that, I mean, yes, you have some other factors in there, but one of them is community. Like the existence of a community around the person increases longevity, whether it be of personal health and or species. You're increasing the quality and the quantity of the life itself. And so I think, being more community thought focused in how we navigate these decisions is huge.
Well, not to keep yammering on, but I just think this is super cool. So that what you were just talking about, that's why we have grandmothers. That's why humans have menopause, or like female human beings have menopause. Is it basically takes them off the reproductive market and allows them to pass on their knowledge to future generations. And so there's only a few species that have grandmothers, that are like, individuals that go through menopause. It's like us, elephants, and like some types of whales. And they're all, we're all intelligent, long-lived species where it's really important for that knowledge transfer, intergenerational knowledge transfer to happen. So anyway, I'll leave it there.
Oh, I love that. That's a really good thing to end on though. We'll leave that as something for people to think about. So John, thank you again for just a great episode. Really good to dive deeper into all this stuff. And obviously we'll keep exploring this topic of energy in a really authentically human way, with some data thrown in there as well. So John, thank you again.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
Energy is inherently a part of everything we do in our lives, but one of the least understood things.
I can see a future where there is limitless and free energy. And that's a pretty beautiful world to live in.